So one of the books I put in with the return is the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, one of my very favorite writers, so much that I named my son's middle name after C.S. Lewis, Joshua Lewis. And this is such an interesting book because it addresses spiritual warfare in a humorous way. And we don't always think about spiritual warfare in terms of humor, but when you do, I think it's really effective. The reason why the enemy fell, and you can read about that in Ezekiel, is because of pride. And if we can laugh at that, it's very powerful, because think of spiritual warfare in terms of humor and fun. I think it's really powerful. One of the things my son always says is fun is a weapon. And joy, when we choose it, can be a warfare in itself. So that's why I think it's interesting that he wrote this book in sort of a humorous way. It's just a fiction story of two demons talking to each other. They want to keep this guy from getting all that God has for him. They want to keep him from God. They want to torment him. And so there's a senior demon talking to a junior demon, writing letters back and forth. So the Screwtape Letters, one of the demons' names is Screwtape. And the one he writes to is Wormwood. So this is on page 62. Chapter 14, and it's about humility. When you read this and you read the word enemy, you have to remember this is a conversation between two demons. So when they mention the enemy of the demons, they're talking about God. So he says, I see only one thing to do at the moment. Your patient has become humble. Have you drawn attention to the fact? All virtues are less formidable to us once the man is aware that he has them. But this is especially true of humility. Catch him at the moment when he is really poor in spirit and smuggle into his mind the gratifying reflection, by Jove, I'm being humble, and almost immediately, pride at his own humility, will appear. If he awakes to the danger and tries to smother this new form of pride, make him proud of his attempt, and so on. There are as many stages as you please, but don't try this for too long, for fear you awake his sense of humor and proportion, in which case he will merely laugh at you and go to bed. But there are other profitable ways of fixing his attention on the virtue of humility. By this virtue, as by all the others, our enemy wants to turn the man's attention away from self to him and to the man's neighbors. All the objection and self-hatred are designed in the long run solely for this end. Unless they attain this end, they do us little harm, and they may even do us good if they keep the man concerned with himself, and above all, if self-contempt can be made the starting point for contempt of other selves, and thus for gloom and cynicism and cruelty. You must therefore conceal from the patient the true end of humility. Let him think of it not as self-forgetfulness, but as a certain kind of opinion, namely a low opinion, of his own talents and character. Some talents, I gather, he really has. Fix in his mind the idea that humility consists in trying to believe those talents to be less valuable than he believes them to be. No doubt they are in fact less valuable than he believes, but that's not the point. The great thing is to make him value an opinion for some quality other than the truth. This introducing of an element of dishonesty and make-believe into the heart of what otherwise threatens to become a virtue. By this method, thousands of humans have been brought to think that humility means pretty women trying to believe that they are ugly, and clever men trying to believe that they are fools. And since what they are trying to believe may in some cases be manifest nonsense, they cannot succeed in believing it, and we have the chance of keeping their minds endlessly revolving on themselves in an effort to achieve the impossible. To anticipate the enemy's strategy, we must consider his aims. The enemy, God, wants to bring the man to a state of mind in which he could design the best cathedral in the world and know it to be the best, and rejoice in the fact without being any more or less or otherwise glad at having done it than he would be if it had been done by another. The enemy wants him in the end to be so free from any bias in his own favor that he can rejoice in his own talents as frankly and gratefully as in his neighbor's talents, or in a sunrise, or an elephant, or a waterfall. He wants each man in the long run to be able to recognize all creatures, even himself, as glorious and excellent things. He wants to kill their animal self-love as soon as possible. But it is his long-term policy, I fear, to restore to them a new kind of self-love, a charity and gratitude for all selves, including their own. When they have really learned to love their neighbors as themselves, they will be allowed to love themselves as their neighbors. For we must never forget what is the most repellent and inexplicable trait of our enemy. He really loves these hairless bipeds he has created and always gives back to them with his right hand what he has taken away with his left. His whole effort, therefore, will be to get the man's mind off the subject of his own value altogether. He would rather the man thought himself a great architect or a great poet than forgot about it, than that he should spend much time and pains trying to think himself a bad one. Your efforts to instill either vainglory or false modesty into the patient will therefore be met from the enemy's side with the obvious reminder that a man is not usually called upon to have an opinion of his own talents at all, since he can very well go on improving them to the best of his ability without deciding on his own precise niche in the temple of fame. You must try to exclude this reminder from the patient's consciousness at all costs. The enemy will also try to render real in the patient's mind a doctrine which they all profess but find it difficult to bring home to their feelings, the doctrine that they did not create themselves, that their talents were given them, and that they might as well be proud of the color of their hair. But always and by all methods, the enemy's aim will be to get the patient's mind off such questions, and yours will be to fix it on them. Even of his sins, the enemy does not want him to think too much. Once they are repented, the sooner the man turns his attention outward, the better the enemy is pleased. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. I really loved that one because it's tricky. I talk about this in The Return, about how God showed me that I had been proud of my humility, that I was trying to be more humble in some area of my life than God was asking me to be, which really wasn't humble at all, it was pride. And so he's describing this in the book, which I think is so funny because I don't remember reading about this particular issue. Even when I read this book several times when I first became a Christian, I wrote about the revelation God gave me about this pride and your humility in The Return. So I love that it's in there, and I love C.S. Lewis, and this is a really neat book about how the enemy tries to mess with our minds, called The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis.